Jake Mercer's boots clanked against the metal grating as he strode down the circular corridor of Orbital Research Station 9. The massive viewport to his right revealed the swirling orange atmosphere of Axair 9 below streak, with electric blue lightning storms that made the gas giant look like it was decorated with veins of neon. He paused for a moment to take in the view, then checked his reflection in the reinforced glass. Not that he cared how he looked, but first impressions mattered out here, where career trajectories could be determined by a single shift. He straightened his grey utility jumpsuit, emblazoned with a transgalactic research and development logo across the shoulder. The fabric felt stiffer than Earth's standard issue, designed to withstand the station's occasionally erratic artificial gravity. His ID badge, freshly printed with Mercer Jacob Jr. Systems. Engineer hung at a slight angle from his breast pocket. "Looking sharp, new guy," called a voice from behind. Jake turned to see a lanky man with an unkempt beard leaning against the quarter wall arms. "Cross, they told me you'd be starting today. I'm Kowalski Power Distribution." He pushed off the wall and extended a hand. Jake shook it. "Jake Mercer Systems. Engineering Systems." Hut Kowalski let out a low whistle. "So you're reporting directly to the Ice Queen, the what Vesa Station Chief of Operations you have?" "Haven't been briefed," Jake shrugged. "They just told me she was axing first. Non-human. I'll be working under Kowalski." Leaned in, lowering his voice. "Conspirator, listen, you seem like a decent guy, so let me give you some free advice. Keep it professional, keep it distant. Don't try to buddy up to her like you would a human boss. Why is that? The last 5 engineers in your position lasted less than 3 months. Something about her whisky." Trailed off, glancing around nervously. "Just watch yourself, all right? She's not like us." Jake's personal comm unit buzzed on his wrist. The holographic display projected a simple message report to his pay office. "Immediately speak of the devil," Kowalski said, backing away. "Good luck, Mercer, you're going to need it." Jake frowned as he watched Kowalski retreat down the corridor. Great, nothing like starting a new assignment with cryptic warnings. The systems control office occupied the entire upper deck of the station's command module. Jake stepped out of the elevator into a reception area that looked more like a high-end research facility than an administrative office. Transparent displays hovered in mid-air, projecting real-time data from every system on the station. The walls themselves seemed alive, embedded with pulsing blue light that followed the power distribution through the station's infrastructure. A humanoid synthetic receptionist looked up at Jake with eyes that glowed the same shade of blue as the walls. "Jacob Mercer Jr. Systems. Engineer reporting as ordered," Jake said, trying to project confidence. "The synthetic nodded. Chief Alessa is expecting you through the main laboratory last door on the left." Jake navigated through a series of interconnected laboratories, each more advanced than anything he'd worked with during his training on Earth. Researchers of various species barely glanced up as he passed a hallmark of frontier stations, where the work always took precedence over social niceties. He paused before the final door, taking a deep breath. The rumors about Vesa had circulated even back at the Academy. Brilliant, ruthless, not entirely trustworthy, if you believe the xenophobic whispers. And now she was his direct superior. The door slid open silently as he approached, revealing a space that defied easy categorization. Part office, part laboratory, part living quarters. The room stretched at least 30 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time view of space above the station. Holographic workstations encircled a central platform where physical equipment hummed and pulsed. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something sweet and unfamiliar that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And there, draped across a sleek metallic desk that seemed to float above the floor, was Vesa. Jack froze. No amount of briefing materials could have prepared him for the reality of her. Her skin was a deep violet, not the cartoon purple he'd expected, but a complex shade that seemed to capture and refract light in impossible ways. Short crimson hair, framed to face with high cheekbones and a sharp jawline that could have been sculpted from marble, but it was her eyes that transfixed him, liquid gold irises that seemed to shine with their own internal light, slightly vertical like a cat's. She lounged across the desk in a position that would have seemed provocative in a human, one leg bent at the knee, the other dangling off the edge her uniform, if it could be called, that consisted of a form-fitting suit of some material that shifted between black and deep purple, as she moved accented with geometric patterns in burnished gold engineer. Mercer, she said, her voice like velvet over steel, lower than he'd expected, and with an accent he couldn't place. I see punctuality as one of your virtues. Jake straightened his posture, acutely aware that he was being evaluated. Chief Vesta, thank you for seeing me so promptly on my first day. She made no move to stand, instead tilting her head slightly as those golden eyes examined him with unnerving intensity. I make it a point to personally assess all personnel under my direct command, especially those handling critical systems. Jake stepped further into the room, stopping at what felt like a respectful distance. Too close would seem presumptuous, too far would suggest fear. I appreciate the opportunity. My transfer fill should have been forwarded to you, top of my class in adaptive engineering at yes. She waved a hand dismissively. The gesture revealed elongated fingers, with an extra joint tipped with short metallic-looking nails. I've reviewed your credentials. They're quite, Jake bit back a retort adequate. He'd graduated with the highest honors in the program's history. Vessa swung her legs around and slid off the desk in one fluid motion, standing to her full height, at least a head taller than Jake. She moved with a predatory grace that made him think of big cats. Back on Earth, humans require sustenance every few hours, correct? She asked abruptly, her tone shifting to one of scientific curiosity. The question caught Jake off guard. Yes, we call it eating. Fascinating. She approached him slowly, her movements measured and deliberate. Her tongue, slightly darker than her skin, ran briefly across her upper lip in a gesture that seemed more contemplative than seductive. My species doesn't consume nutrients like yours. We absorb energy and other resources. I'm hungry, Jake, and her energy is perfectly compatible with mine. Jake shifted his weight, unsure how to respond to such a direct statement. Was this some kind of test, a bizarre corporate ritual accent? Culture was notoriously complex, with social protocols that often baffled human diplomats. I'm not sure I understand. Chief Vesa stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel a strange warmth radiating from her. Then allow me to demonstrate. A simple professional greeting should suffice for initial calibration. She extended her hand palm up in what appeared to be an invitation for a handshake. Jake hesitated only briefly before reaching out to accept it the moment their hands connected. Jake felt a jolt, not painful, but startling, like the static shock you get after shuffling across carpet in socks, except this sensation didn't stop. It spread up his arm across his chest and seemed to pull something from him, not physically, but something deeper. His vision narrowed, darkening at the edges, and his knees threatened to buckle beneath him. Vesa's reaction was entirely different. Her golden eyes widened, pupils dilating dramatically. Her breath caught, then escaped in a trembling exhale. Her free hand gripped the edge of the desk as if for support, and for a fraction of a second her composed expression fractured into something raw and hungry. When she finally released his hand, Jake staggered back a step, his head spinning. He felt as if he just sprinted a kilometer, drained and slightly disoriented. What the hell was that? He demanded. Professionalism temporarily forgotten. Vesa composed herself quickly, though her eyes still gleam with unusual intensity. That Engineer Mercer was a preliminary compatibility assessment. Her voice had a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. Quite promising, I must say. Jake flexed his hand, which still tingled unpleasantly. You took something from me. Energy. She corrected. A minuscule amount. Nothing you won't regenerate within minutes. She turned away, moving back toward her desk with slightly less fluid movements than before. This is an excellent development for our working relationship. Working relationship, Jake echoed, incredulous. I don't remember energy vampire being in my job description. Vesa's head snapped around her, expression, hardening "be careful, engineer." That term could be considered deeply offensive in some contexts. She settled back against the desk. What just occurred was a perfectly normal biological function for my species. We Erin have evolved to absorb certain energy frequencies that other sentient beings generate as a byproduct of their own biological processes. Jake crossed his arms. And you didn't think to mention this during the interview process. It wasn't relevant until compatibility was established. She studied him with renewed interest. You're different from your predecessors. More resilient, their energy signatures were barely sufficient for basic function. A chill ran down Jake's spine as Kowalski's warning suddenly made more sense. Is this why the last 5 engineers in my position didn't last 3 months? Vess's expression revealed. Nothing. Their performance was unsatisfactory in multiple areas, including being lunch. A flash of genuine surprise crossed her features before she suppressed it. You misunderstand. This isn't consumption in the way you conceive it. It's a mutually beneficial exchange. Beneficial? Jake laughed without humor. I nearly passed out from a handshake. What exactly am I getting out of this exchange? Vess's lips curved into what might have been a smile on a human face, but on hers looked decidedly predatory. For starters, continued employment on the most advanced research station in this sector, a rare opportunity to work with technology decades beyond her standard, and she paused. My personal mentorship, which I assure you is not offered lightly. Jake met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated, despite the unease coiling in his stomach. And if I decline this opportunity, then you'll be reassigned to a position more suited to your preferences. Her tone made it clear that such a reassignment would be several steps down the career ladder. Jake weighed his options. He could request a transfer back to Earth, citing xenobiological incompatibility, a legitimate reason that wouldn't black mark his record. But that would mean giving up the position he'd worked years to secure. And there was something else, a curiosity that he couldn't quite suppress. What exactly was happening here? What did she mean by compatibility? How often would these exchanges need to happen? He asked. Finally, Bessa posture relaxed slightly, as if she'd known all along he wouldn't refuse. That depends entirely on workload and circumstance when necessary, always with prior notice, of course. Jake nodded slowly. I want boundaries, professional ones, and I want to understand exactly what's happening during these exchanges. Full disclosure, acceptable terms. Bessa agreed. Perhaps too quickly. Report back. Tomorrow at 800 hours, we begin with a full systems diagnostic of the primary core, followed by a more controlled exchange, so you can better understand the process. She turned to one of the holographic displays, clearly dismissing him. That will be all, Engineer Mercer. Jake stood his ground for a moment longer, studying her profile. There was more going on here than she was admitting. That much was obvious, but he'd come too far to back down now. See you tomorrow, Chief, he said, turning to leave as the door slid shut behind him. Jake could have sworn he heard Valessa release a long, shaky breath, like someone who'd been restraining themselves, finally letting go whatever game she was playing. It was clear that his new boss didn't just want his engineering skills. She wanted something much more personal, and despite every rational instinct warning him to run, Jake found himself intrigued by the challenge. After all, energy exchange or not, it wasn't every day you got to match wits with an alien who could literally take your breath away. Jake strode into the engineering bay the next morning with newfound purpose. The previous night had been spent researching what little public information existed about Axe, and most of it was classified or maddeningly vague. But one thing was clear: they were a notoriously private species whose full biological capabilities remained largely undocumented. He nodded to the engineering team, already hustling around the central power core, a massive cow structure that pulsed with blue-white energy. Unlike yesterday, he didn't feel any need to blend in or appear modest if his new boss wanted his energy. She'd have to deal with all of him morning folks. He called out with a confidence that made several heads turn. Anyone seen the Chief Kowalski glanced up from a diagnostic panel. His eyebrows raised. You survived day one, huh? She's waiting for you in the auxiliary control room alone. He emphasized the last word with a suggestive wiggle of his eyebrows. Perfect, Jake replied, grabbing a toolkit. He winked at Kowalski. Don't wait up. As he walked away, he heard Kowalski mutter, "Poor bastard has no idea what he's in for." Jake grinned. Maybe he didn't, but he was damn sure going to find out the auxiliary control room was smaller than Bess's office, but no less impressive. 3 walls were covered with transparent displays showing every system on the station, while the 4th was a viewport revealing the gas giant. Below, Vesta stood with her back to the door, hands clasped behind her, setted against the swirling storms of Axair. 9 technically, you're 3 minutes late, she said without turning around. Technically, I stopped for coffee, Jake replied, holding up a steaming mug. Earth's greatest contribution to interstellar relations. Want some? She termed those golden eyes narrowing slightly as they assessed him today. She wore a different variation of her uniform, still that strange material that shifted between black and deep purple, but cut more severely with angular shoulder panels that emphasized her height. I don't consume beverages for sustenance, she reminded him. Neither do I at this point. It's just for the pleasure of it. Jake took a deliberate sip, holding her gaze. Something tells me you understand pleasure-seeking behavior. A flicker of something surprise perhaps crossed her features before she masked it. I see you've adopted a different approach to our working relationship overnight. Engineer Mercer, Jake, he corrected. And yes, if we're going to do this energy exchange thing, we might as well be straight with each other. You're hungry. I've got what you need, so let's drop the corporate dance and get to it. Vesa's posture stiffened. That's remarkably direct. I'm a remarkably direct guy. Jake set his coffee down and approached her, stopping just outside what would be normal personal space for a human. So did you drain energy from me yesterday, or not? The bluntness of the question seemed to catch her off guard. She recovered quickly, her expression shifting to clinical detachment. More accurately, I sampled it purely for research purposes, she replied. A baseline measurement to establish compatibility parameters. Jake crossed his arms. On Earth, this would warrant an HR complaint. You're welcome to file one, she countered smoothly, but I should remind you that refusing a direct order from your superior could result in reassignment, and I rather like where you are. Her eyes flickered briefly down his body and back up in a way that was decidedly not professional. Jake couldn't help but laugh. You know where I come from. We call that sexual harassment then. It's fortunate we're not where you come from, Vesa replied, her voice dropping slightly. We have work to do. Engineer, the primary core needs calibration. Jake, he reminded her again. And let's calibrate the core over the next 2 weeks. Jake discovered that Vesa was nothing if not creative in finding reasons for them to work in close proximity. Systems upgrades, equipment testing, security protocol revisions, all legitimate tasks, but all providing opportunities for what Jake had come to think of as feeding sessions. Each time followed a similar pattern. They would work side by side until Vesa would casually initiate physical contact, a hand on his arm, fingers brushing as they exchanged tools, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. The energy transfer would begin, that same pulling sensation that left Jake momentarily lightheaded, but each time something changed. The sensation lasted longer, grew more intense, and Vesa's reactions became less controlled. They were in the substation access tunnel, a narrow maintenance corridor that forced them to work in close quarters. When Jake decided to push back, he said, handing her a calibration tool, deliberately letting his fingers linger against hers. If you're going to keep having me for snacks, the least you could do is explain the nutritional benefits. Vesa's eyes flashed at the contact pupils, dilating slightly. I'm not having you for snacks. As you crudely put it. No then. And what would you call it when you practically shiver every time you siphon off my energy? Jake stepped closer, invading her space. For once, don't think I haven't noticed for a moment. He thought she might step back, maintain that professional distance she seemed so determined to preserve. Instead, she held her ground, looking down at him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Your energy signature is unusually potent, she admitted finally. Most humans provide minimal charge at best. You're different. How Vesa hesitated, then placed her hand directly on his chest this time. The drawing sensation was immediate and powerful, like someone had hooked jumper cables to his sternum. But it wasn't entirely unpleasant, in fact. There was something almost exhilarating about it, a rush that accompanied the drain. Like that, she whispered, her usual composure slipping. Her golden eyes had taken on a luminous quality, and her breathing had quickened visibly. Jake reached up and caught her wrist, not removing her hand, but holding it in place. And what exactly are you getting out of this? Vesa's lips parted slightly. It's difficult to explain in human terms. Try me. She studied him for a long moment. Imagine the most intense pleasure you've ever experienced, multiplied by factors you can't comprehend, compressed into seconds. That's the closest approximation. Jake raised an eyebrow. So I'm basically a walking pleasure battery for you. Vesa actually flushed, her violet skin darkening along her cheekbones in what had to be the accent equivalent of a blush. Your crudeness is unnecessary but accurate. Jake pressed, enjoying her discomfort. Not entirely inaccurate, she conceded. Jake grinned. Well, if I'm providing that kind of service, maybe we should negotiate better terms. Their arrangement evolved rapidly after that. Jake stopped, pretending not to notice how Vesa watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, and she stopped pretending their meetings were strictly professional. One night, after a particularly intense calibration of the station's gravitational stabilizers work that had required them to be in constant proximity for hours, Jake found himself backed against the control console, Vesa's hands braced on either side of him. Depleted, she observed her eyes scanning his face with concern that seemed genuine. I took too much. Jake shrugged, though the room was indeed spinning slightly. I'm tougher than I look. Besides, the way you reacted when you were feeding worth it. She had practically trembled against him, that cool alien composure fracturing completely for several seconds. He felt powerful in that moment, knowing he could affect her so deeply. Vesa frowned. This isn't sustainable. You need recovery time. What I need, Jake said, reaching out to brush a strand of crimson hair from her face, is to understand exactly what's happening between us, and don't give me the scientific explanation. I want the truth. Something vulnerable flickered in those golden eyes. The truth is complicated. I got time. She stepped back, creating distance between them. My species forms energy bonds with compatible individuals. It's rare to find someone whose energetic frequency align so perfectly with our own. When we do, she paused, it creates a dependency. Jake straightened up from the console. You're becoming dependent on me. Specifically, yes. She admitted, the word seeming to cost her. Your energy signature is addictive, far more potent than any I've encountered before. It's why I've had to rotate engineering staff previously. None of them could sustain the level of exchange I required, and none provided the she search for the word satisfaction that yours does. So I'm space heroine, Jake said with a laugh. Great. This isn't amusing, Vesa snapped. It's dangerous. For both of us, dangerous. How she paced away from him, stopping at the viewport. The more I feed from you, the stronger the connection becomes. Eventually, it could reach a point where only your energy will satisfy me, and that's bad. Because acts and mate for life through energy bonds, she said quietly, still not looking at him. It's why we're so careful about feeding. Once the bond progresses beyond a certain point, it becomes irreversible. Jake's eyes widened. Hold up. Are you saying we're getting alien married through these energy exchanges? Vesa spun around, her expression fierce. I'm saying we're approaching a threshold I've never crossed. Before you should request reassignment while you still can. Jake crossed the room to her, moving with deliberate confidence. And if I don't want to be reassigned, then you're a fool, she whispered. But she didn't step away when he came close. I've been called worse. Jake reached out, taking her hand in his this time. Instead of resisting the energy drain, he concentrated on pushing something back toward her, not knowing if it would work, but acting on instinct. Vesa gasped, her entire body going rigid, the golden light in her eyes flared so brightly it see shadows across her face. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice unsteady, giving. Instead of just taking Jake, said, continuing to focus on the sensation of energy flowing between them now in both directions. "Is it working?" Her answer was to surge forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that sent electric currents racing across his skin. It was like nothing he'd ever experienced, a connection that went deeper than physical, as if something fundamental in him recognized something in her. When they finally broke apart, Vesa looked as shocked as he felt. "That was," she began. "Yeah," Jake agreed, slightly out of breath. So much for professional boundaries. Their arrangement shifted into something neither of them had anticipated. The energy exchanges became more frequent, more intense, and increasingly intimate. A touch became an embrace, and embrace became more. Jake discovered that Vesa's ERs connected directly to her office, a spacious chamber with a bed that seemed to float above the floor and walls that could become transparent to reveal the stars. They spent more nights there than apart, each exchange deepening whatever bond was forming between them. But as their connection intensified, Jake began noticing changes in himself. Increased stamina, faster reflexes, moments of inexplicable awareness of Alessa's location on the station, as if he could sense her presence even through walls. "It goes both ways, doesn't it?" he asked one night as they lay tangled together. The artificial gravity reduced just enough that they seemed to hover above the bed. "This energy thing, I'm changing too." Vesa traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip, leaving trails of tingling energy in her wake. "The bond affects both participants. It's why I warned you." Bit late for warnings now, isn't it? Jake caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Not that I'm complaining." She studied him with an intensity that had become familiar. "You should be. None of your predecessors lasted this long. The energy drain alone should have predecessors." Jake sat up, suddenly alert. "Just how many engineers have you gone through?" Vesa's expression closed off. "That's classified information, unclassified," Jake demanded. "How many?" She sighed. 17 in the past Earth standard year, 17. Jesus VI. What happened to them? "Nothing happened to them," she said defensively. "They were reassigned, all alive, all well." Jake frowned. "But none of them could handle the energy exchange long-term. Number none of them could." She sat up beside him, the sheet pulling around her waist in the dim light. Her violet skin seemed to glow faintly, "which is why this situation is unprecedented. You should have shown signs of severe depletion weeks ago." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe I'm just built different," he joked, but his mind was racing. 17 engineers in a year. Was he just the latest in a long line of energy sources for her? Or maybe there's something you're not telling me." Vesa's hesitation told him everything. There have been incidents in Axon history, rare cases, where the energy exchange became mutually beneficial rather than parasitic. Parasitic, Jake repeated, his voice hardening. "Is that what this is to you?" "No." She reached for him, her cool fingers wrapping around his wrist. "That's precisely my point. It's not parasitic between us. Somehow you're drawing energy back from me. Even as I feed, it's creating a circuit, a balance I've never experienced before." Jake studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. "So what does that mean for us?" Vesa's golden eyes met his directly. "It means you're not just food, Jake. You never were. And that terrifies me more than you can possibly understand." Before Jake could respond, the station's alarm system blared to life. Red emergency lights bathed the room as the synthetic announcement echoed through the speakers. "Alert, gravitational anomaly detected. All personnel report to emergency stations." "This is not a drill." Vesa was already moving, pulling on her uniform with practice deficiency. "The core," she said, her voice shifting instantly to command mode. "If the gravitational stabilizers fail, the station gets pulled into axia." 99's atmosphere. Jake finished grabbing his jumpsuit. How long do we have? Minutes. Perhaps, Vesa replied, already moving toward the door. I need you in the primary engineering bay now. As they race through the corridors, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the timing of this emergency was suspiciously convenient, cutting off a conversation that might have revealed more than Vesta was comfortable sharing. But one thing was clear: whatever game they'd been playing, the rules had just changed dramatically. Vesa wasn't just his alien boss with unusual feeding habits anymore. She was something more, something that terrified her. And as the station shuttered around them, Jake realized he might not get the chance to discover exactly what that meant. The primary engineering bay was chaos. When Jake and Vesta burst through the doors, warning lights bathed everything in pulsing crimson, while crew members scrambled between workstations, shouting status reports over the wail of alarms. Report, Vesa commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Kowalski looked up from a diagnostic panel, his face pale. Gravitational stabilizers are failing in sequence. We're being pulled toward the planet at an accelerating rate. Jake pushed past two technicians to reach the main console. His fingers flew across the interface, calling up system diagnostics faster than most of the crew could follow. 5 years of high-stress emergency simulations at the Academy had prepared him for moments exactly like this. It's not a mechanical failure, he announced, eyes narrowing at the data stream. Someone's overridden the safety protocols manually. This is sabotage. Vesa appeared at his shoulder, her golden eyes scanning the display. He's right, these signatures are intentional. Can you fix it? Kowalski asked, real fear creeping into his voice. Jake cracked his knuckles, a confident grin spreading across his face. Despite the danger, can I fix it, buddy? Fixing impossible problems is what they pay me for. He turned to Vesta. I need direct access to the core primary conduit, not the maintenance tunnel. Vesa's expression hardened. That area is restricted even to senior staff. The radiation level alone would kill a human in about 6 minutes. I know. Jake was already grabbing equipment from a nearby locker. Good thing I've got some extra juice these days. Right, some might even call it an alien advantage. Their eyes met in silent communication. She understood immediately what he was implying. The energy exchanges had changed him, possibly giving him increased resistance to environmental hazards. 4 minutes, she conceded. Not a second longer. Jake winked at her. I'll be back in 3. Don't miss me too much. As he strode toward the core access hatch, he heard Kowalski mutter, is he always this cocky during potential death scenarios? Yes, Vesa replied, her tone unreadable. He is the primary conduit to the gravitational core. Was a straight shaft that dropped nearly 50 meters, bathed in the blue-white radiation that powered the entire station. Jake rappelled down with practiced efficiency, the specialized shielding in his suit already beginning to crackle as it absorbed the deadly energy at the bottom. The core itself pulsed like a mechanical heart, a sphere of contained gravitational force that anchored the station in stable orbit around Axer 9. Jake immediately spotted the problem. The manual override panel had been physically damaged, its circuits exposed and reconfigured. Amateur hour, he muttered. Pulling tools from his belt, his hands moved with confident precision, rerouting circuits and bypassing damaged section. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the radiation began penetrating his shielding, but he pushed through the discomfort. Core stabilizing, he reported into his communication. Whoever did this didn't count on a good old-fashioned Earth engineering education. We build things to last. Where I come from, 2 minutes remain for safe exposure. Vesa's voice came through, tense but controlled. Almost done, Jake replied, making the final connections. The core is pulsing steady, the violent fluctuations smoothing into a regular rhythm there. Tell me that's not the most beautiful sight in the universe. Your radiation exposure is reaching critical levels. Vesa responded, ignoring his bravado. Get out now. Jake secured his tools and grabbed the rappel line. On my way, boss. Might need a little pick-me-up when I get back. If you know what I mean, he could almost hear her exasperated sigh through the cowl. When Jake emerged from the access hat patch, the engineering bay had settled into controlled urgency rather than panic status. Screens showed the station's orbit stabilizing crisis. Averted Vesa met him halfway across the floor, her usual composure firmly in place despite the circumstance's radiation levels. She demanded nothing a cold beer and a hot shower won't fix, Jake replied, though the truth was he felt like he'd been hit by a shuttlecraft, every muscle hatched, and his vision occasionally blurred. The edges Vessa's eyes narrowed. She reached out and gripped his forearm, and Jake felt the familiar sensation of energy transfer. But reversed, she was pushing energy into him, a cool, refreshing flood that eased his pain and cleared his head. That's new. He murmured, surprised. Command office now. She ordered releasing him. We have a saber to identify. Hours later, after reviewing security footage and interrogating staff, they had their answer: a junior technician with tie to a fringe anti-alien political group had been caught trying to destroy evidence in his quarters. His plan had been simple: destabilize the station, force evacuation, and prove that working with non-humans like Vesa was inherently dangerous. Ironic that a human saved us all, Kowalski had commented as security dragged the subator away. Now alone in Vesa's office, Jake slumped into a chair, the adrenaline finally wearing off despite her energy boost. Earlier radiation sickness was catching up to him, nausea and dizziness washing over him in waves. You need medical attention, Vesa said, her usual clinical tone undercut with genuine concern. Jake waved it off. What I need are answers. That whole terrifying conversation we were having before the alarms. Let's finish it. Vesa hesitated, then accessed her private terminal. Computer access, classified file, Aaron biological. Protocol 447 bits, authorization, Vesa chief operations, the display filled with information, medical data, historical records, and what looked like case studies. What am I looking at? Jake asked, struggling to focus on the screen. The truth about my species' feeding requirements, Vesa replied quietly. Without regular energy from a compatible source, Axon begin to deteriorate. Mentally, the hunger becomes overwhelming, consuming rational thought. In extreme cases, she paused, we lose control completely. Jake straightened in his chair, forcing his mind to clarity. You're saying you could go crazy without my energy? In simple terms, yes. Vesa's composure cracked slightly. That's why I've had so many engineers. I recognized the signs of dependency forming and transferred them before it progressed too far. But with you, she trailed off. With me, it's different, Jake finished. Because of this two-way energy thing, it's unprecedented, she admitted, which makes it all the more dangerous. Jake stood, moving to her side of the desk, despite his unsteady legs. So let me get this straight. You need my energy to stay sane. I apparently need yours to survive. Radiation that should have killed me sounds less like a problem and more like a match made in whatever passes for heaven in the sector. Vesa looked up at him, genuine vulnerability in those golden eyes. You don't understand. The dependency grows. It will reach a point where only your specific energy signature will satisfy me. No one else is good, Jake said simply. She blinked in surprise. Could yet good. He leaned against her desk, arms crossed. Where I come from, exclusivity is considered a feature, not a bug. Despite the gravity of the situation, Vesa's lips twitched. Your species has a remarkable capacity for adapting to the absurd. We call it rolling with the punches, Jake replied, with a grin that quickly faltered as another wave of nausea hit him. Vesa's expression shifted to alarm. You need to rest. The radiation exposure was too severe. Probably, Jake conceded, swaying slightly. But I've got one more question. First, that circuit thing you mentioned, where we're exchanging energy both ways. Could that help with this? He gestured vaguely at himself. Vesa's eyes widened with sudden realization. Theoretically, yes, a complete energy circuit might accelerate cellular repair. But great, Jake interrupted. Leighton, do that. He reached for her hand. She pulled back. It's not that simple. A complete circuit at your current weakened state could be dangerous for both of us. I'd have to take much more than usual. Then return it amplified the strain on your system. Jake cut her off again, his voice steady, despite his deteriorating condition. I trust you do it. Their eyes locked in a moment of silent communication. Finally, Vesa nodded. My quarters. She said you'll need to lie down for this. Jake barely made it to Vesa's chambers before his legs gave out. The radiation sickness was progressing faster than either of them had anticipated. She helped him to the bed, her alien strength making it easy to support his weight. This was a lot sexier the last time we were here, Jake joked weakly as she positioned him on his back. Vesa didn't smile. This will be intense. I need to create a complete circuit, take your energy, amplify it through my system, and return it. It will feel overwhelming. Story of my life since I met you, Jake muttered, closing his eyes. As another wave of nausea washed over him, Vesa placed her hands on either side of his face. Ready, born ready, he managed, trying to maintain his bravado, even as he felt himself slipping toward unconsciousness. The energy drain began immediately, stronger than anything he'd experienced before. It was like his very essence was being pulled from him, leaving emptiness in its wake. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought he might actually die, that he'd miscalculated how much his weakened body could give, and then the flow reversed. Energy surged back into him, not just the amount she'd taken, but magnified, concentrated, refined. It burned through him like liquid fire, seeking out and repairing damaged cells, neutralizing radiation, restoring what had been broken. Jake arched off the bed, a shout torn from his throat, not of pain, but of overwhelming sensation. Vesa held the connection, her own body trembling with the effort. Her golden eyes had gone luminous, practically glowing in the dim room. Jake could feel her struggling to maintain control, to channel the energy properly without harming either of them. The circuit intensified, energy cycling between them faster and faster until Jake could no longer tell where his energy ended and hers began. It was like they'd become a single system, perfectly balanced, perfectly aligned. When it finally ended, they collapsed together, Vesa falling across his chest, both of them gasping for breath. That was Jake couldn't find the words. Yes, Vesa agreed, her voice unsteady. Jake realized with shock that he felt completely restored, better than restored. Every trace of radiation sickness had vanished, replaced by a humming vitality he'd never experienced before. He looked down at Vesa, still draped across him, and noticed with alarm that she was shaking. Hades said, gently rolling her onto her back beside him. You okay? Her golden eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated to their maximum. Too much, she whispered. Took too much from you. First had to balance it. With a jolt of understanding, Jake realized what had happened. To heal him completely, she'd had to drain him to a dangerous level first, then amplify and return that energy. But the process had left her dangerously depleted. Look at me, he said urgently. What do you need? How do I help? Her eyes fixed on his with evident effort. Energy she managed. Need your specific frequency. Only yours works now. The full implication hit him like a physical blow. This was the dependency she'd warned about, the point of no return. She could now only feed from him, no one else. Take it, Jake said, without hesitation, pulling her closer. Take what you need. Vesa shook her head weakly. Too dangerous. Might not stop. I trust you, Jake repeated, framing her face with his hands, just as she had done to him moments before. Take it with the last of her strength. Vesa initiated the connection. This time Jake focused entirely on giving, pushing his energy toward her with deliberate intent. He felt it flowing out of him, but instead of weakness he experienced a strange euphoria, a sense of rightness that transcended the physical. Vesa's eyes widened in shock as the energy flooded into her. Her back arched, aghast, escaping her lips as color returned to her violet skin. The transfer continued, building in intensity until Jake began to feel the familiar lightheadedness of energy depletion. But just as he thought he Might need to break the connection. Vesa did something unexpected. She adjusted the flow, creating a smaller version of the circuit they'd established earlier, taking his energy, amplifying it, returning part of it in a continuous loop that sustained them both. When she finally broke the connection, they lay side by side, staring at each other in wonderment. That shouldn't be possible, Vesa whispered. A sustainable circuit. It's never been documented, Jake smiled, reaching out to brush a strand of crimson hair from her face first time. For everything right, Vesa caught his hand, pressing it against her cheek. Her usual composure had vanished, completely replaced by an openness he'd never seen before. I never meant to become dependent on you, she whispered, her voice vulnerable in a way that made something twist in Jake's chest. While these things happened, Jake smirked, despite his exhaustion, ready to admit, you enjoy my company now. Or are we still calling this professional development? For the first time since he'd known her, Vesa laughed, a genuine, uninhibited sound that transformed her face completely. Is that truly your concern right now, that I might not admit to enjoying you? Hey, a guy likes to be appreciated, Jake replied, pulling her closer, not just for his energy, but for his winning personality and devilish good looks. Vesa's expression sobered, though a smile still played at the corners of her lips. You saved the station today, and me, I don't know what that makes us, but it's certainly beyond professional. I've got some ideas about what it makes us, Jake said, try in his fingers along the curve of her jaw. None of them HR approved. 3 months later, Jake Mercer stood before the viewport in what had once been just Vesa's quarters, but was now undeniably theirs. The massive storms of Axair 9 swirled below in their endless dance. While behind him, Vesa reviewed reports on her personal terminal. The changes that had begun with their first energy exchange had progressed in fascinating ways. Jake's exposure to Vesa's energy had enhanced his physical capabilities, increased strength, accelerated healing. Sharper senses. Meanwhile, his influence had softened her typically rigid demeanor. At least in private, their unique bond had not gone unnoticed by station administration. After their role in preventing the sabotage, they'd been officially recognized as a specialized team, given joint authority over systems operations, and granted research time to document their unprecedented symbiosis. The new engineer arrives tomorrow, Vesa remarked, looking up from her terminal. My 17th replacement, technically speaking. Jake turned from the viewport, grinning. Poor guy has no idea what he's walking into. Welcome aboard. I'm your supervisor. And this is my alien energy partner, who used to eat engineers for breakfast. Vesa arched an eyebrow. I never ate anyone. Figure of speech, Vi. Jake laughed. Crossing the room to stand behind her, he placed his hands on her shoulders, initiating a gentle energy exchange now as natural between them as breathing. Besides, those days are over. Exclusive feeding arrangement. Remember, she tilted her head back to look up at him. You're never going to let me forget that, are you? No, Jake confirmed cheerfully. It's not every day a human gets to be an irreplaceable resource to a superior alien species. Does wonders for the ego. Vesa reached up, covering his hand with hers and completing their energy circuit. The familiar warmth spread between them, the connection that had become essential to them. Both. I've been analyzing our bonds, she said, her tone shifting to the scientific precision he'd come to find endearing. The data suggests it's still evolving, strengthening there. Maybe further developments. Jake raised an eyebrow. Developments? Like what? Telepathy? Because I've definitely felt some weird moments where I could swear you were in my head. A slight smile tugged at Vesa's lips. Nothing so crude as telepathy, more like a synchronization on the quantum level. The implications are fascinating. Only you could make. We becoming increasingly entangled on a subatomic level. Sound clinical, Jake teased, leaning down to kiss her. When they separated, Vesa's golden eyes were serious despite her smile. Does it concern you that we're changing into something neither human nor has been before? Jake pretended to consider this for a moment. Let's see super strength. accelerated healing a hot alien girlfriend who actually laughs at my jokes now, and a front row seat to the most important scientific breakthrough in interspecies relations. Yeah, I'm really broken up about it. Vessa shook her head, but couldn't suppress her laugh, that genuine sound that had once been so rare and was now becoming wonderfully familiar. Your species' capacity for adaptation continues to astonish me. That's us humans for you, Jake replied, pulling her to her feet. Throw us into an impossible situation, and we'll not only survive it, we'll find a way to thrive. He wrapped his arms around her, initiating their energy circuit with practice. Although I have to admit, finding out I'm basically space heroine to the most beautiful alien in the sector wasn't exactly in my 5-year career plan. Vesa's arms encircled his waist, her head resting against his chest. And I never planned to become dependent on a human with an excessive fondness for terrible metaphors. Life's full of surprises, Jake murmured against her crimson hair. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask, what exactly do Axon do for honeymoons? Because I've got some ideas that might require special clearance. Vessa pulled back to look at him, those golden eyes widening slightly. Are you proposing some form of human marriage ritual? I'm proposing we figure out our own ritual, Jake replied, something that works for whatever we're becoming. For a moment, she simply studied his face with that intensity that had once unnerved him, and now felt like coming home. Then slowly she smiled, not her careful, measured smile, but the full, uninhibited one that transformed her entire face. I accept your proposal, Engineer Mercer. Good, Jake said, pulling her closer, because I wasn't actually planning on taking no for an answer. When Jake had first arrived at Orbital Research Station 9, he thought his greatest challenge would be maintaining its complex energy systems. Instead, he discovered that he himself was the most valuable energy source on the station, at least to the one person who mattered most, and surprisingly, he wasn't in any hurry to resign his position.